Okay. Get back to this. Okay, didn't do what I wanted to do. It's fine. All right. So we discussed literacy and crime among the newly immigrated American citizens. Let's see. It's not quite where I wanted to be. There we go. The various foreign language newspapers. Many were in German. Got one here in French, which the book never actually talked about, but I ran across it while I was looking and thought it was too neat not to show. And then one here in Yiddish or Hebrew, which again also pretty neat. Got what I mentioned last time was actually what the mafia does. Well, the mafia's still around. What the mafia actually does to make money. Less, blatant extortion and violence, and more just like taking over public works programs and grift, or graft, I suppose. Just wasting money, which is a thing that legit organizations are good at. And then just more images here of like the various folks and the tongues as well. All right. So the Statue of Liberty, which, by the way, was 10 years behind schedule, was supposed to be delivered in 1876 for the 100th year anniversary of America's founding. Again, 1776 was when the Declaration of Independence was signed, which is, I don't know, I really don't, I'm pedantic about that. It's like, it's not really a founding, it was just sort of us saying, hey, we're at war now for real. But whatever. It didn't actually get to us until 1886 because the builder wasn't quite where he wanted to be. Also, in the 1870s and 1880s in France, they had something of their own civil war going on. Well, I shouldn't say civil war, their own revolution going on. So it's a wonder it made it here at all. And then when it did get here, we didn't have the base prepared, the big pedestal that it sits on. So they had to leave it in the harbor. Well, not in the harbor, but in the docks for a while they had a donation drive to actually get the base built. Anyway, after all that, the inscription on the base reads to bring her, which is to say America, the tired, poor, huddled masses, but the actual people were far less welcoming to recent immigrants. They were seen as a necessary evil or indeed a menace. Now, for the most part, industrialists were pretty happy with immigrants coming in because they tended to be poor, and if you were poor and desperate, you were willing to work for almost nothing, because almost nothing is still better than nothing. Of course, folks that were already existing here in the United States who wanted to make better than almost nothing were upset at the people who were making almost nothing, because that drove down wages, not the people who were paying them almost nothing. I don't know. It's weird how that works. So most immigrants who came to America were coming because, it was seen as this land of opportunity. But as we saw last chapter, there were some who were very anti-capitalist to the point of wanting a violent revolution. Um, Now, most immigrants were not radicals. Most immigrants were not these, violent anarchists. But most of the violent anarchists were immigrants. And, it's very easy to paint them all with the same brush. It's still happening today. Also, yay, new levels of racism, because why stop at just how things had been? In 1790, Congress had passed a statute that limited citizenship to whites, which left out Native Americans and any freed blacks. Of course, this was before the 14th Amendment, which did at least fix that. There were even debates on whether Catholics and Jews could be considered whites. So this wasn't even like looking at ethnicity or skin tone. It was just who they were and where they were from. So as people began coming from Eastern Europe and were different from, your Anglo-American groups, it became more about where they were from and what their religion was than actual skin tone. Because when you had people coming from like Poland and Yugoslavia and Russia and literally the Transcaucasian Mountains, where Caucasians are from, and the argument was they're not white enough, is clearly not about the skin tone. Because again, there was this push early on that like Irish aren't white because they're Catholic. It's like, have you seen an Irish person? And this leans into the next slide. This idea of racial inferiority, using the so-called science of the day, which gets real dark, categorizing people that somewhere further down on the evolutionary scale, which isn't how that works, but whatever. Like even among, for one, human species is human species, but like there isn't an evolutionary scale. Like a bird is as evolved as like an amoeba. They're just set for different locations and what they're doing. In fact, people say, oh, well, back in the age of the dinosaurs ruled the earth. Like, they really didn't. There's always been more insects than us large creatures. And in fact, today, I'd say bacteria is probably winning out in terms of sheer numbers. So, yeah, it's not necessarily how advanced something is in terms of how evolved it is. That's something from a very human-centric standpoint. Very, very egotistical. So here's the Statue of Liberty sitting in the docks, waiting for the pedestal to be finished, so just kind of hanging out. Also, the Statue of Liberty was originally this very bronze color because, again, it's made out of copper, but they put it in the middle of a bay of salt water, and if you're familiar at all with what happens to copper when it's exposed to all this oxidation, it turns very green. If you've ever had a penny that got really badly weathered, it turns green. Oh, right. So here's when we talk about racism in this era, it's also lots of anti-Semitism. So here's a thing that I never thought I'd ever see. Besides just the people being depicted as, extremely horrible anti-Semitic stereotypes, you've got the bird up here, you've got this fish, and even the whole ship. Like, Okay, wow, we're going that far. It's the new transatlantic Hebrew line for the exclusive use of the persecuted, and it's got, in quotations here. Because, it's not like Jews have been persecuted throughout all of history. I mean, granted, this was before, the 1930s, but even, I don't know, as far back as recorded history, Jews have been getting the short end of the stick. This is a different image. One, again, I wasn't quite expecting, but having a bit more knowledge on this era of history. So here we have a view of America from the north. So again, this is not usually how we see America. This is, the Gulf of Mexico is down here. So here we have the Irish on the east coast and the Chinese on the west coast. The great fear of the period, Uncle Sam be swallowed by foreigners. So you've got the Irish and the Chinese eating Uncle Sam. And then at the end, the problem solved where the Chinese end up eating the Irish, I guess. So, sure. This one takes a turn. So we have this like apocalyptic image here in the background. I mean, this thing here with like devil wings. I mean, if you look too hard at the grasshoppers, you realize they've got these really racist caricature Chinese faces. Anyway, here in the caption, Uncle Sam's farm in danger. And this is where the churn happens. 70 millions of people are starving in the northern provinces of China. All who can do so, are making preparations to come to the United States. Look out for the grasshoppers, Uncle Sam. So like it starts out with 70 million people are starving. Okay. Those who can are going to try to make it to America. Okay. Look out for the grasshoppers. Oh, all right, yeah. So, let them starve, I guess. This next image is in the book. It's called "The Stranger at Our Gate." There's a caption underneath it, but apparently I couldn't find that image. It just has the immigrant talking to Uncle Sam. Says, "Can I come in?" And Uncle Sam replies, "I suppose you can. There's no law to keep you out. At least not this guy." United States, America, admittance free. Walk in. The guy. In case writing on comics wasn't make it obvious enough. Sabbath desecration, anarchy. I'm just read it out of the book. The book one's a bit more clear. Intemperance, because oh no, they drink. This a dig at the Irish. Disease, poverty, superstition. Yeah, can't have that. But we're not done quite yet, because we've got this horrific image. The U.S. in the hands of the Jews. Wall Street, Republicans, Democrats, and again the Rothschilds, which were the boogeymen before we had Soros. So it's just another horrendous anti-Jew thing, which is besides the conspiracy that's gone back forever, it was the Roman authority that crucified Jesus? The Jews were there, but also Jesus was a Jew? I don't know. Anyway, now Nativism and eugenics, yay. So nativism is this idea that this influx of foreigners were a danger to one's native society and culture. I remember John Oliver did a short, just a short internet piece on Thanksgiving, and about how every Thanksgiving there's always this thing about like anti-immigration and all that. And he's like, I think there was one instance of people who thought that the immigrants coming in were gonna ruin their way of life, and then he shows a picture of like Native Americans. And yeah, I feel like if there was one instance of foreigners posing a serious danger to one's native society and culture, it was probably the Native Americans. And every other native culture that the British/European powers wiped out around the world. But this idea that like Eastern European, Semitic, and Slavic races were going to wipe out the American culture. Like, what is American culture? It's a combination of various European cultures and also like some original ideas that formed by us being over here independently, which is just something that happens when European powers are kind of away from Europe. I don't know. It's just weird to imagine that this idea of like an independent, unique American culture when we'd been around like 100 years at this point. So a number of organizations like the Immigration Restriction League and the American Protective Association wanted to restrict immigration, and in the case of the American Protective Association, wanted to reduce the rights of Catholics in America. I'll get to that latter one in a minute. I've got an image that shows that, and I'll explain what that's about in a little bit. It's something that was big in Britain and Ireland too. Well, there was Maryland that was established early on under, I don't remember the guy's name now. It was like a lord in England that was Catholic, and he was getting away from that. But like there were more Protestants than Catholics coming out of England, so he had to make sure that there was like religious toleration. But yeah, it was so that Catholics could be there without being oppressed. But yeah, there's the more modern, closer to 1900s, there was like this panic about Catholics in America, which I'll get into in just a minute. Like as late as JFK, there was this panic about Catholics. But before we get back to that, there was this pseudoscience called eugenics, advocated for biological engineering. Now, obviously, this isn't like umbrella corporation, weird lab stuff. But this idea of selective breeding of desirable races to counter the population growth of the, quote, useless races, which is to say, especially the folks coming out of the Catholic nations, because they tend to have big families. Eugenicists also wanted to institutionalize those seen as being unfit and sterilize those they considered mentally impaired, as well as the licensing and regulation of marriages to promote better breeding. Boy, this all sounds really familiar, doesn't it? If you're at all familiar with things going on in Europe in the 1930s, yeah, it started here. The ideas used in 1930s Germany started here in America. FYI. So, Now, obviously, not everybody was all, eugenics and weird stuff. There was some level of middle ground of assimilation, like with the Native Americans, where let's just help the immigrants get rid of their old traditions, which again is like not great, but I guess it's better than trying to make it so they can't have kids. That's technically genocide. People suggested assimilation of immigrants using education and the adoption of American rituals and holidays. 1892, American schools adopted the Pledge of Allegiance, extolling American virtues like liberty and justice for all. The under God part wasn't included until the 1950s due to the Cold War, because the USSR officially was an atheist state, so we had to be as anti-USSR as possible. So we included under God. The national anthem being played at sporting events wasn't until the Gulf War, or maybe a little bit later. It was a relatively recent thing, and that wasn't like all the sports events decided they were going to do it. That's paid for by the U.S. military. By the way, still, a lot of the older immigrants never quite caught on with learning English, though many of them did try. Learning another language is difficult, especially when you're older. When you're younger and you're growing up in it, it's a lot easier. But I've tried learning a multitude of languages, and it just never stuck for me. My Italian friends are quite good with English, so good on them. But in Europe, it seems like being multilingual is just the norm, because so many countries are crammed together in the space of like Texas. So it's just how things are over there. But once you reach a certain age, your brain just isn't quite as what did they say? It's brain elasticity is the term. Some people can pick it up at any age, because some people are just good like that. I've never been good like that. So I've got some images here, because, I like having images. Rome, rum, and red. You don't want Catholics. You don't want... I'm not sure what rum would imply, because I would think initially the Irish, but that would be included under Catholics, I would think. And then the reds, obviously, communist. Here's a nice big image. Mafia in New Orleans, anarchists of Chicago, socialists in New York. And then you've just got a bunch of dudes here with lovely labeled hats. English convict, some dude with a monkey that isn't labeled. Italian, what's that say? Brigand. German socialist, Polish vagabond. Back here, Irish pauper. Oh no, he's poor, kick him out. This was particularly good. This one again from Puck. Puck and Harper's Weekly are both really good magazines. So it shows the poor immigrant coming in. He's just got, a couple of bags. Not even bags, just like blankets that he's wrapped all his stuff in. And you've got these rich business owners that are telling him they don't want him here, to go back. You're, ruining the neighborhood. But behind them, you've got the shadows of their ancestors, who were all also poor immigrants who came to America seeking a better life. And because they made it good, and through various generations they ended up being rich, now that they're on top and doing well, they don't want poor people here. And as I said to my class yesterday, unless you're 100% Native American, you're not from America. Your family's line is from elsewhere. Now, normally I'd say you're an immigrant, but I'm not going to be like Ben Carson, because if you're descended from a family of enslaved folks, that's not immigration. That's people who were forced over. I think Carson was talking out of his ass there. Now, granted, I do believe there were groups from Africa that did like immigrate on their own, but most did not. And I'm not going to say that like, oh yeah, they just immigrated. It's the American dream. It's like, no, not getting crammed on a boat and half of them dying. It's not the American dream. Anyway, here's the weird Catholic thing. So, shall he be allowed to rule America, the hand that would rob us of our freedom? So here's the idea. Traditionally, and this is rarely a thing among even Catholics, like, because again, my professor that got me into doing all this, he's Catholic, and I not once heard him be like, well, the Pope said this, so I guess I've got to do it. But traditionally, Catholics are beholden to the Pope above all else. Now that's like medieval traditionally. So like if you were, I don't know, a lord in the king's court in, say, England, but you were Catholic, and the king said, I don't know, do A, but the Pope said to do the other some other thing, you had to listen to the Pope because you were spiritually beholden to the Pope, even if you were legally bound to the king. And, you know, the Pope's in charge of what's going on with God, so that's a bit more important than what the king says. Now, realistically, if, say, a Catholic senator were to get into power, and the Pope told him to push some law that would harm America and be really obvious that the Pope was pushing for power or something, that's not going to happen. Or in the case of, as I was saying, JFK, John F. Kennedy was Catholic. And that was like one of the major oppositions to him becoming president because, oh, well, if he's Catholic and the Pope tells him to do something, he'll have to do it. He can declare war on anybody, and the Pope can just control him. And that never happened because the Pope hasn't had power since, well, I'd go as far as to say World War II because the Pope had his hand in a lot of stuff in Germany. But even then, I'd say not since at least the Enlightenment. So yeah, and like today especially, you know, Joe Biden's Catholic. And most of the stuff you hear about him when it comes to religion is like, oh, he's not even religious. It's like the dude's OG religious. It's like original Christian religious. So yeah, this is an old scare tactic from way back in the day. But it's something you hear about for a long time. It's a long time before Protestants and Catholics are on each other's throat. At least here in America. It's still a thing in like England and Ireland, but that's more historical stuff than it is actual religious stuff. But that's what this is about. It's just this idea that Catholics are supposed to listen to the Pope above all else. Help wanted, no Irish need apply. This is a very common sign. And, you know, insert any other group of the time, Italians, Polish, Russian, etc. She is proud of it, too. And obviously this was before World War II because this wouldn't have even been necessary. They wouldn't have even been around. They'd be in the... let's just say concentrated into camps, which we'll get into later. Oh, this is a hell of a thing. So, this is the eugenics thing. This light flashes every 15 seconds. Every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes for the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded criminals and other defectives. Okay. Some people are born to be a burden on the rest. This light flashes every 16 seconds. Every 16 seconds, a person is born in the United States. And the last one, this light flashes every 7.5 minutes. Every 7.5 minutes, a high-grade person is born in the United States. I don't know why it's will, I guess, and will have the ability to do creative work and be fit for leadership. About 4% of all Americans come within this class. Hoo boy. And that's part of the Fitter Families Contest, which is here. Registering human pedigrees. Kansas develops fitter families, remarkable experiment in eugenics. You know, back when eugenics wasn't a bad word. And there's actually I'm saying eugenics should be a bad word. I'm not one of those weird people that I've seen post online. It's like, if it wasn't for Hitler, eugenics wouldn't be a bad word. It's like, don't be on the side of eugenics, dude. Yeah, their families are judged and registered. The center is a fitter family surrounded by examiners. How do they examine for fitter? Well, I'm not quite there yet. So these are all the different ideas that go into eugenics. How does one decide how a person is fitter without, the actual genetics? Because that is something that some level of science is doing today, like making sure genetic defects don't happen and whatnot, which I feel like is probably a pretty noble goal. But back then, it was stuff like this. How are their heads shaped? What is their skin tone? Because, that's how you can tell if someone's a criminal or not. How thick are the eyebrows? How long are their ears? Yeah, that sort of thing. And some people still think that's the thing. Ada Juke, 1740. And I guess this was 150 years later. 92% of her descendants, 64 mentally diseased, 174 were sex perverts. In 1890, I don't know what that even would mean. 196 were illegitimates, which again, like in 1890, I don't even know what that would mean. 142 were paupers. Oh no, they're poor. 77 were criminals and murderers. I feel like murderer would go under criminal, but whatever. Her sterilization would have cost $150, which is like half of what I would pay for my cat nowadays. Oh, this one's one of my favorite. Here is the split in the timeline for Martin Killicack. What a name. So here on the right, married to worthy Quakeress. She bears 7 upright, worthy children. Poor lady. From these 7 worthy children came hundreds of the highest types of human being. That's a lot of Quaker kids. And on the dark timeline, old Two-Face there. Dallied with a feeble-minded tavern girl. She bore a son known as Old Horror. Well, it's just bad naming. Who had 10 children. Jesus. Old Horror needs to watch it. From Old Horror's 10 children came hundreds of the lowest types of human being. Well, see, here's the thing. He could marry the worthy Quakeress and dally with a feeble-minded Quaker tavern girl, because, he's Two-Face. Besides, this one's got a little flower in its hat. Yeah, there's a lot going on there. All right, let's move on from that before I get off on another tangent. One last bit on assimilation before we get into the cities. So obviously not all immigrants were able to fully assimilate. but they were still not the same people that had left their home countries. I mean, I again mentioned this to my previous class. When I was up in Rhode Island, I could tell that my accent had diminished, because when my mother and aunt came to visit, I heard myself say y'all like 8 times in a 30-minute ride it took us to get back from the airport. So it changes depending on the people you're around. And that's just within the same country, just different regions. You go into an entirely different country, again, I mean, I went to Ireland, which is still an English-speaking country. You do pick up different things from being immersed in a place for any period of time. Israel Zangwill, English-American Jew, portrayed the hope of assimilation with his play The Melting Pot, which became the ideal of assimilation. So it was portrayed in cartoons, business corporation ceremonies, lessons in school classrooms. It was the perfect propaganda piece of, this is America, we're all going to come together and be one big homogeneous group and everything's going to be great. But it was really just an ideal. It was just this, well, it was a piece of propaganda. I mean, I don't think Israel Zangwill intended on it being propaganda. It was this hopeful message. But it was used like, this is how it should be, this is how it's going to be, and if it's not, it's your fault. But immigrants never really lost the social, cultural, and religious and political identities they had brought with them. I mean, hell, when I was in Ireland, I tried to make sweet tea. It didn't work. Their tea is very different than ours. And even if all immigrants tried to become fully assimilated, the anti-immigrant sentiment that many native-born Americans had was still there. So even if, a bunch of Polish people tried to fully assimilate and get rid of all their old cultural identities and all their old traditions and stuff, they still looked and sounded different. And they would be seen as other. And no matter how hard they tried to assimilate, they'd never truly be seen as real Americans, at least not within the first generation or two. So the true way things were, my words sometimes don't quite work. The sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, who we will see a couple more times in later chapters, he's really important and really well written. He put this in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, in which he described the two-ness of the blacks in America, the identity of their African heritage and past as slaves and as free citizens in America. I've got a quote here that I will show you guys in a minute. But he described the double consciousness, this warring of their old selves and this new identity in America, and how that could also apply to immigrants, because again, while they maybe weren't quite as traumatized as African Americans and the horrors they had to go through to get here, and their time here, and then finally being freed and still being treated like absolute garbage, immigrants certainly didn't have an easy time of it. So they existed like a vegetable soup, which is to say, they were individuals within a broth, as opposed to a homogeneous soup like the Melting Pot. So they changed a little bit to fit what was around them. but they were still themselves to some degree. So I've got the melting pot, which reminds me of Kirby's Final Smash and Brawl. It just seems like everyone's being devoured by this terrifying cauldron. Here's Zangwill. America's God's Crucible, the great melting pot where all races of Europe are melting and reforming. The real American has not yet arrived. He is in the crucible, I tell you. He will be the fusion of all races. Which there have been some ideas looking forward as to like what people will look like in, say, 100, 200 years. Because people are being separated less and less among ethnic lines. Now, of course, certain very racist, very nationalistic groups are very opposed to the idea of, intermixing of ethnicities. But, we've always had groups like that, and they tend to become louder and louder as they shrink more and more in number. So eventually they'll go away. Here is Du Bois. It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. One feels this two-ness, an American, an African, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. He had a way with words, and he, again, is extremely important as we continue on in this time period. He was a contemporary of, oh no, I lost the name of the guy. I can't remember. We'll get to it later. I got ahead of myself and then I lost the guy's name. All right, let's do some city stuff before I completely run out of time. All right. So, between the Civil War and the turn of the century, the population of the United States quadrupled, but the population of the cities increased by a factor of 7. So in 1870, 1 in 5 Americans lived in a city of over 8,000, while in 1900, 1 in 3 Americans lived in a city that size. So what that means, which is something that we talk about in slightly greater detail in my European history course, is that people were not only immigrating from, well, that's just the next point. People were not just immigrating from other countries, but they were also moving from the countryside into the cities. So that's why you see a higher concentration of people in the cities towards 1900 as opposed to in 1870. So small towns became sprawling cities, and as the cities grew, you had skyscrapers, electric lights, water and gas pipes, sewers, subways, etc. And again, as I mentioned to the previous class, with this era of major changes, the people took notice. Sometimes things will change and you don't really notice until after the fact. And you guys were not even around when this happened, but I remember when the internet became like a household thing. It existed before I was born, but it was like something you only had in offices or like the military. But I was a kid in the 90s when you could have access to it in the house. And it wasn't the best, nothing like today. But it was new enough that even as a child I could tell like it was a major change. And folks back then could tell that this was a major shift in history. Reverend Samuel Lane Loomis, said, "We live in the age of great cities. Each successive year finds a stronger and more irresistible current sweeping in towards the centers of life." So, as I said, this is the same thing was happening in Europe. Small farms failed. People congregated in the cities to find jobs. And as people moved into the cities to find jobs, the cities had to grow to accommodate all these people. And in order for the city to grow, you needed more construction for the city to be built. So for the greater construction, you needed more people. So more people flow in to fill those construction jobs. So you needed more places for them to live, so you needed more construction, so you had more people come in. It just created a cycle of supply and demand, but labor. And there's a lot of images like this at this time period. The turn of the century was really interesting. Late 1800s is probably my favorite period of history, both from a technological and ideological standpoint. Because you can see here, you've got this, I think this is like a loading bay right off on a side street. So you've got, trucks here loading stuff up, and then right next to the trucks are horse-drawn wagons. Because the trucks are pretty new. This is like early 1900s. The trucks are new. They're not especially reliable, and they're really expensive. So if you can't afford to buy a truck to put stuff in, you just get a wagon and put a horse on it because you're used to that. So this was the turning of this age of moving from horses and wagons to cars, but cars were still too expensive for a lot of people, so you still had a lot of these horses and wagons. This to me is just a really cool image of this transitional period. And these are just a lot more of those wagons and rail cars and all of that side by side. This one's older because it's just the wagon and the people. Building the skyscrapers. You don't need safety equipment up there because if you fall, nothing's going to stop. Nothing's going to help. He's got gloves on at least. All right. So before the Civil War, commerce was what created the cities. Obviously, it was the ports that was where the things grew. I mean, that's always been the case. Again, as I said to the previous class, like as far back as, I always go to Athens, but I mean even further back than that, Cairo and Mesopotamia, it was the rivers. It's always locations near water. New York, Boston, San Francisco, New Orleans, Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Detroit also were near a large body of water. And then we had railways. Railways were a major game changer when it came to creating cities because now you could move commerce inland easily and relatively cheaply. So as I mentioned, cities grew not just from foreign immigration, but also from internal migration. People being driven off farms either because they realized they weren't making enough money or because the farm was taken back by the bank because they went bankrupt. We'll discuss the electricity, structural steel, and increased plumbing technologies made it possible for the cities to grow and gradually eliminated the dangers of this congested living because, boy, these cities were dangerous. And not just because there's a lot of people and people tend to get violent, but shit burns down in these cities. And these cities are full of disease. And, hoo boy. Obviously, cities attracted black as well as white farmers, though, of course, black farmers had to deal with racial segregation and discrimination because, of course. Between 1890 and 1914, nearly 500,000 blacks left the South to head north, and the North wasn't quite this free promised land that they thought it would be because, well, it was still very racist. And as we're going to see in later chapters, it's pretty bad. So they faced discrimination and often found themselves pushed into black-only ghettos like the immigrants and had to rely on each other to get by. So despite having been in the United States since like the late 1700s, and, you know, enslaved for hundreds of years, and then finally freed and facing discrimination, they were still treated like the newly arrived immigrants. They never get a break. So I've got the growth of cities here. Again, hardly anything here in the Carolinas. We might have had Columbia by then, but it wasn't much of a city at that point. Atlanta has always been a major city, but we didn't have anything. And Birmingham only existed because it was an iron forge. There's some major railways. I guess we had we had Charleston. But that was it. Here's city growth between 1880 and 1900. Yeah, you can see Charleston, Columbia there. I don't know what these two are. That's too far north for Greenville, and I think it's too far north for Spartanburg. I would say one of them might be Charlotte, but that's on our side of the line, not North Carolina, so I don't know. That said, having driven up 95, from Richmond on, it is just one big mass of a city. It's horrible. It's been that way since 1900. Speaking of cities, all right, so let's discuss the actual technology behind this. So, before 1860, bricks. Buildings were built with bricks and stone, so you could only really build so high. You had maybe 4 or 5 stories, and then it was starting to crumble, and you didn't really want that. As late as 1880, church steeples were usually the tallest structure in a town because that wasn't like a load-bearing structure. You just would build a tall wooden thing and put a cross at the top, and that was it. You didn't have to worry about putting people up there. However, with the city populations growing dramatically, the land values increased, so architects had to figure out how to put a lot of people on the same plot of land. So builders started using cast iron, which allowed them to build up to 10 stories. These were known as cloud scrapers and were not around for very long because structural steel was soon invented, and then we got the skyscrapers because structural steel was better than cast iron in every way. It was stronger, which obviously, and it was also lighter. It's just weird because usually if something's stronger, it's also heavier, but not steel. Steel is stronger and lighter than iron. Just better in every way. So skyscrapers reached 30 stories initially, and then we had electric elevators and radiators, which made it so you didn't have to have fireplaces on every floor, because when you've got 30 plus stories, you don't want fireplaces on every floor. That's a good way to kill people. Allowed these structures to climb even higher, because again, you don't want stairs going up 30 stories. Good God. Um, yeah, that'd be a nightmare. And also, improvements in transportation allowed the cities to spread outward as well. Um, Workers either walked or took a horse-drawn rail car, which, it got you a little ways, but it certainly wasn't the bus. 1873, San Francisco, later followed by Seattle and Chicago, had a cable-driven trolley car, which some of those are still around, but usually in little touristy towns, typically up in the mountains. I'll show you an image of one in a little bit rather than trying to describe it. And then later on, we had electricity for electric trolley cars, which is something that's still famously in San Francisco, and also terrifies me because hearing electricity pop makes my spine hurt. Also, subways, because you can't run a train in a subway. You will suffocate everyone. So, having electric-powered subway is very important. Once again, structural steel. They were able to build large bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge, which allowed for the cities to span rivers and further the scope of the city. So rather than the city being, hemmed in by the water, now you can build these big bridges and the city can expand even further. Even if someone from New York would be like, once you cross the bridge, it's technically Brooklyn or what the hell ever. But, I mean, it's still New York. People in New York are very specific about what the neighborhoods are called, but it's like, it's all New York. Everything north of D.C. is New York. Anyway, this also meant that those who had more money could actually afford to get out of the cities into suburban areas and, have a little house out in the countryside, while the working class people were trapped in the cities in a cycle of high rent and low wages. So that's why the inner cities are seen as, these nightmares. Because they were kind of designed to be. So here's some of the wrought iron buildings. They still exist, largely because they're aesthetically interesting to look at. Oddly enough, a lot of them are in New York, which has some pretty high property values. It's surprising they didn't eventually tear them down and build bigger buildings in their place, but they're probably considered historic landmarks at this point, so they can't bother them. That's the only way I can see them still being around. Again, the Flatiron Building, the first skyscraper, at least in New York. I think maybe in America. Another early skyscraper. Also got this neat image of a bunch of different types of buildings. We've got some of these small storefronts here, some of the medium-sized cloud scrapers, and then the true skyscrapers in the back. The true early skyscrapers in the back, not, the ridiculous ones we have today. And also, again, just showing the age of New York here, where you've got a graveyard right next to this really tall structure. Also, in case you guys have never seen a radiator, because I hadn't actually seen a radiator in person until I went to Ireland, this is what a radiator looks like. Now, granted, there are modern ones that just like run natural gas, but the old ones were attached to a hot water system, and it would run hot water through this metal, and that would radiate, hence radiator, radiate the heat outward very efficiently. They still use these up north because it gets cold as hell up north, and using a central air like we do down here just would not work up there. So it's better to use radiators when it gets, negative 30 on a good night, or on a good day, actually. My friend in Wisconsin. Yeah. So here's the horse-drawn rail car. It's on rails, so the horses can't wander off. They just provide the pull power. Here again is a bunch of different things. You've got like a trolley and the horses, and there's a car in the back there somewhere. There's the cable-drawn car. It's got a cable under the ground here, and it pulls the car along. Here's the electric one. There was a atmospheric railway. I need to find an image of that. That's a completely different thing, and it was horrible and gross, but kind of amazing. Yeah, these terrify me, because as it's going along and you're riding along this power line, and it occasionally comes down and sparks, and it's, ugh. Here's the subway. They're quite nice, the subways. At least they were early on. There's the Brooklyn Bridge. It was originally mostly for the trains, and with a few walkways and, I guess, carriageways, and then they had to completely redesign it for what it is today, which is like all cars, and then there's like a separate deck underneath for the trains. There's some folks. Very safe place to be there, Junior. I think this was closer to like the 1940s, but yeah, suburban area. All right, since we only have 5 minutes left, I'm not going to get into this other stuff. I'll see you guys next week.